Child labor. In the absence of child labor laws, many children worked long hours at difficult and dangerous jobs in mines, factories, and on farms. In 1900, 1 out of every 6 children between the ages of 10 and 15 worked for money. Often jobs required 10 or more hours a day and paid only a few cents an hour. Chief among these was the South's growing textile industry, which heavily relied on the cheap labor of children. On October 24th and October 29th in 1929, around $9 billion were wiped off the New York Stock Exchange. The greatest crash put an end to the Roaring Twenties and began the financial slump that was known as the Great Depression. There have been slumps in the past, but the effects had always been limited to particular industries or regions. This time, the entire nation suffered. The new national media was partly to blame. By reporting events from around the country, the media made the slump seem worse than it really was in the early stages. People lost confidence in the economy, and it began to spiral out of control. Unlike the crash, the depression came on slowly. Politicians and business leaders claimed it would be no more than a part of a normal business cycle. President Herbert Hoover, 1874 to 1964, led the optimists, claiming in 1930 that the worst was over. But to most people, it was obvious that the situation was getting worse, even after the crash stock prices kept falling. General Motors (GM) stock fell from $212 per share in 1926 to just $8 in 1931. In 1932, American industry produced only half of what it had made in 1929. Wages kept falling, with unskilled workers being paid only 7 cents an hour. By 1932, most politicians and business leaders had given up on the idea that the economy would improve quickly or easily. In the United States, for example, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set the minimum age at 14 for employment outside of school hours in non-manufacturing jobs, at 16 for employment during school hours in interstate commerce, and at 18 for occupations deemed hazardous. If you think school hours are long, children that worked in factories worked a lot longer. Children that worked in factories worked precisely 12 months in a year for 8 hours a day. Lewis Hine photographed the poverty of newly arrived immigrants and the street and factory life of working children. This is what Lewis Hine looked like. Lewis Hine was a New York schoolteacher and photographer who devoted his life to the fight against child labor. In the early part of the 20th century, millions of children worked in factories and mines, all day every day, for poverty-level wages, in conditions that were unhealthy and dangerous. Hine went into factories to photograph these children so that America could see the conditions they worked in and how the work affected them. The National Child Labor Committee (NCLC) began pushing for a national law soon after its founding in 1904. Its leaders couldn't get President Theodore Roosevelt to back a child labor ban introduction by Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge in 1906. But, with the president's support, Congress did order a large-scale study of child workers by the Bureau of Labor. A 1912 law also set up the Children's Bureau to report on all matters pertaining to the welfare of children. In 1916, Congress passed the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act. The law banned interstate sales of anything from factories or mines that used child labor. In 1918, the U.S. Supreme Court held that law unconstitutional. Here is a video from the History Channel to explain more of what happened and what some people were thinking.
Hi, my name's Yahu Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about child labor. Children have been an important part of the labor force throughout human history. But in the 19th century, this became a problem due to industrialization, as children were exposed to dangerous working conditions. Employers, however, saw a huge benefit to the use of child labor. Children were smaller and more nimble, and so therefore could perform functions that would be more difficult for adults. In addition, it was more difficult for children to unionize, and employers could pay them lower wages than they had to pay adults. This, however, was a deep source of concern for reformers, who believed that children were not only placed in jeopardy by virtue of this work, but that they also should be receiving an education instead. Reformers pointed to the horrible working conditions, the long hours, and the low wages that children received. In the 1840s, just as American reformers were having some success in limiting child working hours for native born Americans, an influx of immigrants from places like Ireland provided a fresh supply of child labor for the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. Between 1902 and 1905, several organizations committed themselves to seeing an end to child labor in the United States. But it wasn't until the advent of the Great Depression that real change was on the horizon. With so many Americans out of work, labor unions and laborers began to clamor for an end to child labor to ensure that the adult working population would have enough jobs. This proved to be an important development. Lawmakers actually drafted legislation which ended the practice in the United States, limiting working hours and improving working conditions for young people. One of the lasting legacies of the battle to end the use of child labor is the importance of education. American reformers were able to make the case successfully that young people in a democracy needed to be educated in order to perform their civic duty. Young people in large numbers came out in